in World War I, Iran was effectively occupied by the Russians and the British. Atatürk is just an astonishing character. He had the looks of a matinee idol, blonde hair, blue eyes.
He was a gangster. He was quasi-psychopathic,
yes.
But he was also someone who devoured literature.
The foreign policy of a great nation cannot be formed by small cadres of aggressive activists. And that's rule number one. That is not a national interest.
Joining me this week on Quite Right is the historian Simon Sebag Montefiore. He's written histories of Russia, he's Stalin's most famous biographer, and he's also looked at the entire history of the world through the prism of families, the personal relationships that have defined the ages. And now he's turned his attention to arguably the most controversial area of history, the Middle East, the cauldron. And in this book, Simon looks at the last 120 years and the way in which the modern Middle East, the arena, the cockpit of conflict, has been created, and the individuals who played such a prominent part in making the Middle East the focus of everyone's geopolitical attention. Simon, why did you feel it was necessary to write another book on the Middle East? There are so many histories of the area.
First of all, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me at the Spectator. Secondly, the Middle East has become a sort of literary industry, and there are thousands of books on the Middle East, and virtually all of them are about very small areas of the Middle East, obviously Israel, Palestine, and the oil powers, Saudi Arabia. There's a huge industry about writing about Sykes-Picot and the sort of period just at the end of World War I. But other areas are completely neglected. And of course, there are endless histories of the Iranians, the Turks, and so on, which are less widely read. But when I wanted to look and find a history that explained how the modern Middle East was made over the last 125 years, there is no such book. There are many books on the Jews, there are many books on the Arabs, but there isn't such a book that covers everything. And so I always follow my hero, Benjamin Disraeli, who said, when I want to read a book and I can't find it, I write it. And so, obviously not comparing myself with great humility to great Dizzy, but so I suddenly realized this book didn't exist. I want to write it. And I want to write a book that explains everything you need to understand what is happening today, not just in Israel, Palestine, not just in Iran, but also in Morocco, in Sudan, in Yemen, and in Turkey. How is Erdogan so important? And, just looking at how all these states were formed, how Turkey was formed, how modern Iran came to exist. And so this book is self-consciously written to be read by anybody. You don't have to know anything about the Middle East to read it, but if you do know something, that's great too. And it's the one book that I hope you can read and understand what is happening today.
I think that anyone, whatever their level of knowledge, will find something new and illuminating in it. Because, as you point out, so many of the crises that we're dealing with at the moment, obviously the war in Iran, obviously the situation between Israel and its neighbors, but also things like the Moroccan incursion into the Spanish enclaves of Ceuta and so on. All of them are interlinked, and this book brings that out and makes those connections. But is there a single event which you can look at, which you can say is perhaps the most important event in the last 125 years, which is, if not a starting point, certainly a helpful catalyst for understanding?
Well, I start the book in a slightly unusual place, because most people start these books. There's a certain sort of convention that you start these books at the end of World War I at Versailles with Lloyd George and Clemenceau forming the modern Middle East, or something like that. But I begin with Ibn Saud, the young Saudi prince in exile, leading about 40 men across the desert of Najd to take Riyadh, to storm Riyadh at dawn in 1902. And so I start the book with that rather exciting event. He breaks into the town, he climbs over the wall, he breaks into the governor's harem and hides there until dawn. And then when the governor gallops out of the fortress, they open fire and seize what becomes the capital of the new Saudi state. So that's where it begins. Of course, everything is covered in the book. 1918, the Versailles Conference, all the creation of the Balfour Declaration, Palestinian Arab revolts, Syrian revolts, all various wars that made Morocco. But in answer to your question, I think the key event of modern times is 1979, the Iranian Islamic Revolution. And that is the sort of absolute prism through which one can see what all that's happened since 1979. And I think that, and I argue in the book, that the 1979 revolution really ranks up there with the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and the Russian Revolution of 1917 for being a epoch-forming and shaping event. And Khomeini himself, Ayatollah Khomeini himself, the first imam of the Islamic Republic, he ranks up there with people like Stalin and Mao as a revolutionary leader. Now, because we have very weird attitudes to religious leaders in the West, partly because of our watery, secular world now, where we're very confused by religious leaders, we're afraid of them, but we're also revere them because of their passion is something we so lack in our own societies often. And so because Ayatollah Khomeini looked sort of like a stern fire. He's always described in the press as a firebrand and is referred to as a sort of medieval firebrand. Because of that, he doesn't look like what we expect of a revolutionary leader, where we expect people to be in a stalinka jacket, tunic. But he was such an astonishingly shrewd, cunning,
yes, he seems
fearsome player.
Medieval, not modern. But one of the things that you bring out is that the Islamism, or the particular flavor of Islamism that Khomeini represented, is a modern movement. It's a 20th century movement with 21st century power.
Yes, I mean, it's always written about, again, you're absolutely right, and it presents itself as a throwback to purer times in the sort of 7th century or 8th century or whatever of Islam. But actually, you're absolutely right. Islam is a modern ideology that really ranks with other modern religious political ideologies like political evangelical movement in America or military Zionism, for example. And it's a modern ideology that I plot in the book exactly how it was created by people like Qutb and other people.
Said Qutb, the principal ideologue of the Muslim Brotherhood, who you also profile in the book.
Yeah.
And in a way, the two events that you mention, arguably they're connected, and please tell me if you think this is wrong. So the book begins with the as you point out, with Ibn Saud establishing Saudi rule, which goes on, of course, to encompass almost all of the peninsula. What that betokens, what that foreshadows, is the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, because, of course, much, not all, of the Middle East was under Ottoman rule at the beginning of the 20th century. And it's the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the idea of the caliphate in 1922 that leads to, or in the immediate aftermath of the First World War, that leads, as you point out, to the Western and colonial powers partitioning different parts of the Middle East, having mandates and colonies and so on. And then in 1979, what you have, and of course it's foreshadowed by Arab nationalism, in 1979 what you have is Islamist success. And the Islamist argument is that the Arab and the Muslim peoples had, by turning away from the true faith, by embracing barbarism, jahiliyyah, that they had forsaken power, and it was only by going back to that purer form of Islamic rule that Iran exemplified that progress could be made. So is it right that we can see so much of the history of the Middle East through the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the incursions of the West, and then attempts by Arab nationalists and Islamists to reclaim some of the former glory?
That's right. I mean, we're still seeing the fall of the Ottoman Empire, just as we're still seeing the fall of the Soviet Empire, which is much more recent, of course. But we are still seeing the reorganization of the Middle East after the Ottoman, and the fact the loss of a single dominant ruling power is still being felt in all the sort of different rivalries, ethnic, sectarian, and otherwise, and political that we're seeing today. And you're absolutely right. There is a line from one to the other. And of course, in 1979, the Islamic Revolution in Iran, they presented what was happening as the sort of beginning of real Iranian independence, regarding everything that happened before and all the regimes that are allied to the West, such as the Shah, as not really independent states. And so for them, the Islamic Republic marked Iranian independence. And of course, what I show in the book is that, Iran is so interesting because we regularly hear now with the war with Trump that it would be impossible to conquer Iran. But one forgets that in World War I, Iran was effectively occupied by the Russians and the British and invaded regularly by the Ottomans. In World War II, it was partitioned effectively between the Soviets and between Churchill. Just one of Churchill's rather fascinating wars. And by the way, one of the interesting, I think one of the sort of untold stories in the book, jumping subjects here wildly, Michael, if I may, is the Anglo-French War for the Middle East, which is a completely forgotten episode, but which is an interesting one because, Britain actually invaded Syria and Lebanon, and also invaded Iraq.
In the Second World War.
And also, yes, and so in 3 campaigns, they invaded Syria and Lebanon, then Iraq and Iran. And the British took all of them in order to secure the British flank in World War. But that involved, and what was interesting is in Syria and Lebanon, it involved actual fighting against French forces.
So you had Vichy French forces,
yes,
and Brits, and they'd been allies, just a year or so beforehand,
That's
but they were actually directly in conflict.
Yes, and actually there were, in fact, conflicts right the way through, again, because with de Gaulle afterwards in 1949 is another thing, which was like a fascinating moment. The third British occupation of Damascus, again, forgotten events, was in order to insist that the French actually gave Syria independence, which they were trying to rescind.
And again, the persistence of the colonial interests, the imperial interests of the West in the Middle East, indeed, it's arguably its resurgence in recent years, is a consistent theme. But of course, set against that are the nation builders that you profile. Because, of course, as the Ottoman Empire collapsed, as the West wrestled with the retreat of empire, so nation builders emerged. Ben-Gurion in Israel, Atatürk, of course, in Turkey, Reza Shah, as you mentioned, in Iran. Of them, who do you think was the greatest? Or is there another figure, maybe Ibn Saud?
Well, I think Ibn Saud, Abdulaziz, of King Abdulaziz, as they call him in the kingdom, he's definitely the most successful figure of the entire book, actually, because given the fact that as we know, most democratic political lives end in some definition of failure, however glorious. The fall of Lloyd George, for example, is a classic, destroyed by Turkey, by the creation of Turkey, that we might come to in a sec because it's so interesting. But King Abdulaziz of Saudi Arabia is so successful. He starts with literally nothing, with sort of 40 men on horseback, and he ends up building the biggest state. One forgets how enormous Saudi Arabia is. They're getting the biggest state in the Middle East by far. And he dies in his bed, successful, handing over power to his son, not the right son that he would have preferred to leave it to, because he had to leave it to his son Saud rather than to Faisal. And then you look into our own times, and you have Donald Trump going there for his first trip for the first term, and the second term he goes back and declares Saudi Arabia the center of the world, and that's the grandson of Ibn Saud.
So it's a successful nation builder and the successful not founder, I suppose, but progenitor of a dynasty.
Yeah, he really is a founder of a state, because it had never been a kingdom before. But most people don't realize, and again, this is all explained in the book, that this is the third Saudi state. The first one was in the 18th century, created by a Saudi emir in combination with a sort of a revivalist imam who led a movement to reassert Salafi Puritanism in Islam, and they launched this holy war between them, which threatened Ottoman Baghdad, which sacked the holy Shia cities in what is now Iraq, and so at that point the Ottomans called in their most powerful ally, who was Muhammad Ali the Great of Egypt. And he invaded Arabia, destroyed the Saudi state, sent the Saudi leader to Constantinople, where he was beheaded in public. So that was the second. And then there was a third one in the 19th century, which ended with the downfall of Ibn Saud's father in the 80s and 90s. And so he was in exile in Kuwait. And against the will of his father and everybody, he led this expedition into the desert and started to re-establish. And it was like an old-fashioned conquest.
And obviously Saudi Arabia is the most powerful, the wealthiest Arab state. But of course in the Middle East you have, as we alluded to, at least three other powers, non-Arab powers, Turkey, Iran, Israel, all of which were in their current form, again, post-colonial creations, or they had a post-colonial evolution. We touched on Iran. Of those three figures who were responsible, in effect, for the creation of those states as we understood them in the 20th century, Atatürk and Ben-Gurion and Reza Shah, are there any lessons that you can draw from their three lives?
But they had such fascinating lives, and these are such astonishing people.
Yeah.
Brilliant people, actually. And the book is really told through many of these characters.
Through individuals and families.
But also through all of the individuals we would have heard of, the Shah, Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi, Arafat. But those three stand out along with Ibn Saud. Yes, so Ataturk is just an astonishing character. He had the looks of a matinee idol, blonde hair, blue eyes, and he was by far the most successful Ottoman commander. He'd defeated the Allied attack at Gallipoli, and he made it extremely difficult for the British to advance into Palestine in 1917, 1918, when he took command there. And he was also a sort of heavy drinker and womanizer. At one point, he had a sort of drunken fight with Nouri al-Said, the future strongman of Iraq, which ended with Nouri al-Said breaking a bottle over the future Ataturk's head. So he's an interesting character, but of course, he really understood that in 1920, the Western powers had decided to partition the Ottoman Empire at Sèvres and San Remo conferences. And we know about the mandates, about how they were about to form the mandates. Britain got Palestine and Iraq and Jordan. France got Lebanon and Syria. But what they were planning to do in the north was to create a Greek empire with Italians on the side. And they were willing to give what is now much of what is now Turkey to the Greeks. And this was one of Lloyd George's...
To Anatolia.
To give most of Anatolia, along with states for the Armenians and the Kurds. And the Armenians and the Kurds never really got their state. And the French were going to get the eastern part as well, the southeastern part, Cilicia as well. And the British and the French were going to occupy Constantinople. And all that was going to be left for the Turks was the area around Ankara and the Black Sea coast. So Ataturk, then called Mustafa Kemal Pasha, mobilized forces, defied the Sultan's government that was in a state of sort of surrender and submission to the West, and first of all threw out the French, then defeated the Armenians and the Kurds, and then turned to the Greeks.
Yes.
And in massive battles, of hundreds of thousands of troops, he defeated the Greeks.
And of course, you mentioned earlier that Lloyd George fell around that time, and that was because Lloyd George had been entranced by the then Greek Prime Minister Venizelos, and that Lloyd George committed Britain to the Greek side, and in the humiliation that ensued, that was the cause of Lloyd George's fall.
The two kind of neoclassical, you could say, in the broader sense, projects that he embraced were the Balfour Declaration, which should be called the Lloyd George Declaration, really, and the Greek, this idea of Greek nation, the wider Greek sovereignty, and of course, Ataturk called his bluff, and the British were not willing to go to war against him, and therefore, out of this, he created Turkey, very successfully, and Turkey has been an immense success. And it's a success that is being reaped now by Erdogan in a very different sort of regime.
Yes, because as you point out, you have Atatürk, this blonde, blue-eyed, drunken womanizer, a modernizer in his time.
A huge modernizer.
And now Erdogan, who's actually presiding over, if anything, again, tell me if you think this is wrong, Turkey's further ascendancy is almost a sort of neo-Ottoman figure. In that he wants Turkey to become more Islamic, and he wants Turkey to be the preeminent regional power rather than a modern nation state.
That's right. Erdogan is now talking openly, along with all his ministers, of not only retaking Jerusalem from Israel, but also his preeminent position, Turkey's preeminent position in cities like Damascus, Beirut, Aleppo, which were, of course, Ottoman vilayets, in the empire only recently, only relatively recently. And so he is definitely embracing a neo-Ottomanist, sort of neo-imperial view. So Ataturk creating this state is an extraordinary process in defiance of the imperial powers, in creating a ethno-religious definition of what a Turk was, because really there was no difference between the Turks and the Greeks. I might be unpopular among both for saying this, but basically he basically defined that the Greeks were were Christian Ottomans and Turks were Muslim Ottomans. And that was the divide. And this was a war in 1920, 21, 22 that was, caused enormous population swaps between Greeks and Turks, massive ethnic strife, war, and the creation of a new ethno-religious republic, the Turkish Republic, and the Turkish people. So terribly similar to the creation of Pakistan later. And Israel even later than that.
Well, coming to Israel, again, so much of the commentary on the Middle East naturally, perhaps naturally, turns on questions of Israel, Palestine, Israel and its neighbors. But looking at the book, I think, am I right in thinking that what you do is, rather than rehearsing some of the old arguments about Israel and its neighbors, you look at Israel as another Middle Eastern country emerging from the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, influenced by the West, with nation-building leaders, so Ben-Gurion, like Atatürk, and indeed Ibn Saud and the Reza Shah. And in that sense, what you do is you restore a sense of perspective. So it's not the case that it's an apologia for any individual country or leader. What it is that it helps us to understand the whole neighborhood and Israel's place within it.
That's right. I mean, Israel is just one of the states, succession states of the Ottoman Empire, in effect, under the Western mandates. And it's very typical of the way that these states were formed. Of course, it's unique. They all are. The creation of Turkey is very unique. The creation of Pakistan and India are very unique. But you're absolutely right. I see it as a continuum. I see it as part of the region. And in many ways, it fits into many of the themes of the book. And I don't flog it as a subject, but it's in its place, as it should be. Nothing is either concealed or hidden, neither its flaws nor its merits. And I treat it very much like I treat Turkey or Pakistan, which is slightly outside the realm of the book. But that brings me on to the founders of these countries. And I think Ben-Gurion is an extraordinary figure. I mean, of course, now we can see that he made certain mistakes in the formation of Israel, but the strategic brilliance of winning a state, a Jewish republic, he definitely ranks up there as one of the great figures of the 20th century, one of the great nation builders. And as does Reza Shah, again, a very different figure, but someone whose extraordinary Napoleonic trajectory, in fact, further than Napoleonic, because as you know, Napoleon was a minor Corsican noble, while Reza Khan, as he was known as he rose up the military, was of peasant origin, a peasant Cossack horse groom, who was a striking figure. I mean, 6'6" or 7, strapping, ascetic and inscrutable, mysterious, and extremely intelligent and cunning, an enormously talented politician and visionary, with flaws, autocratic nature, and in the end, a paranoia that led him to execute and murder quite a few people. But his vision of what Persia, as it was then, could become was extraordinary. And this Cossack groom, who was a member of a junior soldier in the Russian-trained Cossack regiment formed by the Qajar Shahs, and he rose up that, and where he was an expert on the machine gun, known as Reza Maxim, after his virtuosity with the Maxim machine gun. And in 1925, this man became the new king of a new state, which he renamed Iran. It had always been called Iran and Persia by Persians, so this wasn't quite such a sort of change as is sometimes presented. But he immediately set about forming Iran into a modern state with modern education, railways, banks, universities, and started to free women from the hijab, from the veil, in a campaign. And the result was really astonishing achievement, which is the benefits of which are enjoyed by his son later, the Shah, but also by the Islamic Republic, ironically, today. So he ranks up there as a massive figure, but he made a terrible mistake in 1939-40 by trying to maintain neutrality between the Nazis and Churchill, which led Churchill and Stalin to decide to overthrow him and invade Iran.
One of the things that again comes through is that the sort of classical conception of a nation state is that its borders are defined by a people, by an ethnic identity. So Hungary is the land of all Hungarians and so on. So, of course, it's not like that. And it's particularly not like that in the Middle East. So Iran is a country which is, of course, predominantly Persian, but contains within it Arabs and Kurds and others. Similarly, as you point out, Turkey has a significant Kurdish population. The Mandate Palestine, as we understand it, has both Jewish and Arab citizens. And the Arab peoples are divided into different states overall, with, in some cases, emirs and historic families, in other cases, presidents, whether elected or those who've seized power, in charge. And do you think that the language of nationalism is inadequate to the complexity of ties and allegiances and peoples within the Middle East?
Yes, I mean, that's one of the things I argue in the book, is that nationalism and the nation state is ill-suited to the very complex multitude of ethnicities and sects within the region. And I think that many states will be destroyed by that, may be destroyed by that, and that may be what's happening in different countries, Libya and maybe Lebanon. We just don't know. Though also we're at a moment of great opportunity for all these countries as well, I believe, despite the turbulence that we see. But other states like Iraq are quite successfully now kind of promoting a sort of federal concept. And so you have the Kurdish autonomous region, which is kind of run by the Barzani family, who are one of the great dynasties of the time. And by the way, the Kurds are one of the peoples that play a big part in the book and are normally neglected.
Yes, quite.
And so the Kurds are, I've got many different attempts at Kurdish states in Syria, in Iran, in Iraq. And, the Kurds were, like the Jews and the Armenians and all sorts of other peoples, promised a state at the end of World War I and didn't get one. Some did, some didn't. And we look at why they didn't. And the Kurds, the Druze, the Alawites, the Chaldeans, the Assyrians are all these peoples whose stories are told. But anyway, I think nationalism has ill-served the region. And I think nation states, it's ironic, isn't it, that while in the West we now kind of disdain the concept of a nation state, we're very eager to impose it on the Middle Eastern peoples.
Yes.
Which is one of the many examples of a sort of neo-Orientalism.
Well, quite. Before we go on to that, which is a rich vein, I just wanted to touch on the I suppose the person who personified and articulated Arab nationalism, Nasser,
Yes.
who was Egypt's leader in the 50s. Can you tell us a little bit about him, his rise to power, his significance, and his fall?
He's also, one of the key figures in the book, because there was a time when the Night of Dreams, as he was called by Arab poets, really restored to the Arab world their pride.
Yes.
And he was an amazing orator. He was also very funny, which is there's a great there's a great speech which I write about in the book where which you can watch, by the way, on YouTube or whatever, where wearing black tie, bizarrely, which is, of course, it's the 1950s, he talks to a huge assembly, and he mocks the Muslim Brotherhood for wanting to put women into the hijab, and he uses an extremely rude word for the hijab, something like a handkerchief, and he says, like, well, how does the Supreme Guide expect me to put 10 million Egyptian women in hijab when he can't get his own daughter, one woman, to wear the hijab? And of course, the whole audience roars with laughter. So you sort of just realize how much things have changed in our time. But Nasser was very complex character with eclectic intellectual interests. He was the son of a minor official in Egypt, but he was always highly intelligent, extremely well read, and felt that he was the man who could one day rescue Arab and Egyptian nationalism. He seized power in 1952 in the Free Officers' coup. And in that coup, he was one of those very clever people who managed
against the king.
King Farouk. We must discuss. Interesting character. But in this coup, he managed to get the support of everybody, including
nationalists,
the Muslim
Islamists,
Brotherhood, the Islamists, the army, and by tricking everybody, really. And then afterwards, he then set about making himself dictator, and his great triumph was seizing the Suez Canal. After which, Anthony Eden, who was one of the many British prime ministers who feature in the book in detail, became demented with fury, and literally said, "Can we murder this man?" And the British are quite bad at assassinating people. They wanted also to assassinate the Mufti, the Palestinian Arab leader, but they also failed to achieve that. But he then launches this war with Israel and France to retake Egypt or retake the Suez Canal. That failed
in
completely.
1956.
That failed completely. This made Gamal Abdel Nasser the most powerful man in the Arab world. He achieved a union with Syria, and he became essentially the dictator of Syria and Egypt. And many other states aspired to join the United Arab Republic. And for a moment, he looked like he was going to be a Saladin-like figure who could threaten Israel as well. But in the end, hubris, corruption, misgovernance, and the creation of a police state in Egypt, and along with a failed war, neo-imperial war in Yemen, a coup against him in Syria, and then a hubristic embrace of ever more extreme anti-Israel rhetoric led to the 67 war and disaster.
You mentioned King Farouk, and there are, as well as these amazing nation builders and nation breakers, there are some figures who exercise power in the Middle East who have, I hesitate to say, a comic element to them, but certainly an element of lubricious domestic detail that makes you think that history is both about great men, but also about their foibles. So King Farouk and also Muammar Gaddafi, both of them have historical significance, but also an approach towards certainly the opposite sex, which absorbs. So can you tell us a little bit about both of those?
Well, Farouk was the last king of Egypt, and he was descended from Muhammad Ali the Great, very interesting character who was really the greatest Egyptian ruler, really the greatest ruler in the Arab world of the last 250
In the
years.
19th century, yes.
And he was in the 19th century. He was a Napoleonic figure, and a Turkish Albanian. He was actually born in what is now modern Greece. Got control of Egypt, made himself an autonomous ruler, almost conquered the entire Ottoman Empire, and did conquer Syria and Palestine and so on. And then ultimately founded a dynasty that ruled all the way from 1806 to 1952 when Nasser. And so the last of his descendants, his scions, was King Farouk, who, when he ascended the throne of Egypt in the mid-30s, was the most beloved figure in Egypt, hailed by crowds of adoring. He was slim, he was handsome, he was educated. He was the first of those Turkish rulers to even speak Arabic. They all spoke Turkish before that. And he quickly deteriorated into a political bungler, but also his personal life deteriorated into a well of Sybaritism. But he became enormously fat. He became addicted to sex, but is also said to have been impotent. He became addicted to eating oysters, but was also suffering from bulimia, it's said. He became really addicted to having negotiated relationships with an enormous array of women, American models, Jewish showgirls, Egyptians, Levantines, Greeks, Italians, all of whom were kind of flown into Egypt and paid vast amounts. One's got to realize that partly because of a cotton boom, he was vastly wealthy, and he owned a lot of the land in Egypt as well. But he also tried to assume the leadership of the Arab world. And that was a very complicated thing. He had to keep the British happy. Egypt was basically still a British protectorate of a sort. He had to keep the Muslim Brotherhood happy. There were now millions of members of the Muslim Brotherhood. There was a fascist movement in Egypt that he had to keep happy. And then he had his army and his intelligence services. And while he was very friendly with the Jewish community, actually, in Egypt, many of his girlfriends were Jewish as well. He also, with the creation of Israel, realized that he had to embrace Arab nationalism. And therefore, in 1944-45, he created the Arab League, which is still with us, which was an arena of his rivalry with the Iraqis, who were the other big Arab country at the time. And then in 1948, he found himself invading Palestine and trying to crush Egypt and trying to really conquer Palestine for Egypt. And he formed an organization called the All-Palestine Protectorate, which was going to be the way that the Egyptians ruled Palestine and whatever they could get of it. But he was tempted for childish acts. For example, he loved pickpocketing people, which is not a very royal pursuit or hobby. And he famously actually pickpocketed Churchill and stole his watch and then gave it back to him during the meeting. And of course, Churchill was quite unamused by this.
Yes, you would be.
And he, the British leadership called King Farouk the boy. And they were constantly discussing whether to get rid of the boy and put somebody else on the throne. But Farouk in the end was destroyed by 1948, by the Palestine War, in which Egypt was appallingly defeated by the Israelis.
Yes, all of the countries surrounding Israel.
Yeah, the 5 countries that invaded Palestine, trying to destroy Israel, actually made Israel, first of all, because Israel was able to expand outside the borders given by the United Nations plan. And all of them were defeated to a certain extent, except really the Jordanians, whose army, the Arab Legion, was British trained, led by Glub Pasha. And they actually did defeat the Israelis, and they were able to annex the whole West Bank, what they called the West Bank.
And that epic, colourful, at times hilarious, at times shocking life sums up some of the paradoxes of those who exercise power but also succumb to temptation. And the same might apply to Muammar Gaddafi?
Yes. I mean, Gaddafi is also another key figure. He seizes power at the age of 29. He looks like a rock star.
Yes.
He is a autodidact who has read everything and is frantically reading books on nationalism. He also has a slight a Islamic upbringing, like many people, and therefore he constantly combines the uncombinable of Marxism, Arab secular nationalism, and the Quran into what he calls the green ideology, which is his, which he invents and writes himself. But he is basically, his whole career is based on worshipping Nasser.
Yes.
And so Nasser thought he was a very sweet boy. When Nasser died, he tried to buy Nasser's body in 1970 for $500 million, which the Egyptians obviously refused to hand over. He then tried to negotiate all sorts of mergers with Egypt, which the Egyptians had no intention.
No.
The Egyptians regarded themselves as the leading people of the Arab
The civilizational
world.
leaders of the Arab world. And they would have regarded the Libyans as peasants.
As parochials, provincials. And in fact, the Egyptians had regularly tried to get control of Tripoli and Tripolitania, as it was called, or Cyrenaica, and failed to do that. So Gaddafi was also a brutal dictator. Executed, assassinated, murdered everybody he could find who resisted him in any shape or form. He was absolutely brutal, a sort of Caligularian tyrant. But he also specialized for the rest of his career. He was in power for 40 years. He specialized in causing enormous trouble in the Arab world.
Yes.
Sponsoring terrorism, and was responsible for the explosion of the Pan Am jet over Scotland,
over Lockerbie,
the Lockerbie thing, and many other appalling outrages. He backed the IRA, but he also specialized in telling inconvenient truths to the other Arab leaders. And most famously, there was a famous speech he gave in 2008 to the Arab League conference in Damascus, when he lectured them all, and he said, like, let's be honest, when you people owned much of what we now call Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza, you never formed or even attempted to form a Palestinian state. How then did we object to it? We now claim we object to Israel when we didn't really object to it before 1967. And there was enormous embarrassment. And you can actually see on the film, again, this is something worth looking up on YouTube, because you can see the enormous embarrassment on the face of it. He then goes on to threaten to kill the crown prince or king of Saudi Arabia, and I think he tried to hire Carlos the Jackal to do the assassin. Carlos the Jackal is another major figure in the book. But by the way, the Gaddafi played one last massive significant role in his death.
Yes,
and his killing. You'll remember there was. I think you were in the government at the time.
Yes.
Yeah.
When the UK government and the French government intervened in order to prevent what was considered to be a likely massacre in Libya.
But promised to spare, promised the Russians that they would spare Gaddafi.
Exactly.
And Gaddafi, of course, was one of the long-term, for 40 years, Soviet and then Russian allies in the Middle East, along with other countries, several other countries, Syria, Iraq, and so on. And it was promised that he wouldn't be killed, but he was killed, and it was filmed. And he was sodomized with a bayonet. And this was a film that was watched
by Libyan rebels.
By Libyan rebels, not by British and French governments. But nonetheless, Putin watched this many times and regarded this as one of the great betrayals. And it was one of the moments that changed him from someone who acquiesced in American unipower to a determined opponent of the West. And so it was that led to his intervention in the Syrian civil war and his saving of Assad, which led to the death of hundreds of thousands of people.
One of the things that has come through, as you described, all of these absolutely fascinating figures without whom one can't understand the history of the Middle East, is that so many of them were either autodidacts or voracious readers, or both, essentially.
Yes.
And of course, this is a feature of Stalin. One of the things that your books on Stalin bring out is that, of course, he was a gangster. He was quasi-psychopathic, but he was also someone who devoured literature, was an eternally hungry pursuer and consumer of biography and history. Do you think, actually, that one of the marks of the political leaders, whatever their morality or ideology, that succeed, even in the most bloodthirsty of ways, is that all of them are actually far more educated, learned, far more dedicated students of history than we're inclined to allow?
Yes, and it's a strange dichotomy, isn't it? Because in one sense, we're always surprised when very educated people like Stalin,
yes, are monsters,
who was an autodidact and didn't go to university, but was trained at a seminary in classical Russian, read everything, you know, Zola, Dickens, Balzac, Victor Hugo, and so on. And, you know,
all these great works of realist literature, which are supposed to make you humane.
Yeah, and wrote love poetry, which was regarded it's in Georgian, but was regarded in Georgian as incredibly successful poetry. So we have this dichotomy. We are very surprised when what we expect to be uneducated people, but in fact are brutal politicians, are extremely educated and knowledgeable. He was also a great fan of Dostoevsky, which he said, which is why we've got to ban it.
Yeah.
It was a typical Stalin joke. But the dichotomy is that nowadays we have very overeducated students, graduates, who actually aren't reading books anymore and are actually basing their views on a sort of form of counter-history, which is not based on facts at all. So it's so ironic.
If we're analysing Trump in Iran, if we're looking at Netanyahu in Israel, if we're thinking about MBS in Saudi Arabia, what are the best set of tools for understanding how they operate?
We've got to step back and just look. This is really what I write about in The World, is, you know, we've got to look back and understand the era we're in, first of all, which is like, you know, the period, I call it the great 70-year peace after 1945, was not a usual period. It was an extraordinary period, literally in the meaning of extraordinary, and it was exceptional against all the trends of world history.
Yes.
And so it ended when in 1985, when we saw the sort of second period. The first period was a sort of a game of chess between the Soviet superpower and American superpower. Orderly, cold, calculated, but based on a balance of some sort. The second period after 1985, and really to the first election of Trump, was the unipolarity of America. Which was more like a game of solitaire, and of course, you know, much of the opportunities of that period were wasted. We can now see with wars that sucked American will, and now we're in the third period, which is a multiplayer game, computer game, with many powers competing.
Yes,
and so people often talk about the post-Westphalian nation state. We're now in kind of pre-Westphalian period where new states are competing for their own interests, playing off bigger states, playing off there are still mega powers, the two original ones, America and Russia, but of course China is now one of the mega powers, and we need a new express with superpower is no longer enough for them. And there are many middle powers that I call intercontinental powers that are now able to project themselves outside their traditional regions with their own interests. I mean, we see it with Saudi. You mentioned MBS. I mean, America is still going to be his biggest protector, probably, but he's turning to Pakistan now, for example. Well, Pakistan has massive problems of its own. It's been at war with India within the last year. Now it's at war with its former clients, the Taliban in Afghanistan. Plus, it has at least two local insurgencies. So it's kind of cosplaying as a local regional power, while in fact falling apart behind the scenes. But it has this impressive paladin, the Field Marshal Munir, who Trump calls his favorite Field Marshal. It's probably the only Field Marshal he knows, in fact. So when you look at all these powers, Netanyahu, MBS, they're all playing a new game of regional power broking and competition.
Where does Britain fit into this? Because, as you point out, from Lloyd George through Churchill to Eden, British prime ministers have found their fates decided or shaped by events in the Middle East. Andy Burnham, immediately before he became prime minister, issued an apology for his predecessor Keir Starmer's attitude towards Israel and Gaza.
Yeah.
Kemi Badenoch has been very clear in her support for Israel against the anti-Semitic criticism.
Yeah.
Of course, she has her criticisms of the Netanyahu government, but
as we all do.
As we all do. So, in that sense, it's not binary defined, but it is interesting to see how Middle Eastern politics play into the UK, and also how our prime minister and our aspirant prime ministers react to these global affairs. Are there any early lessons that you've drawn about the Burnham style of leadership? Are there any thoughts you have about the Badenoch style of leadership?
Well, I think the Burnham style leadership is fascinating that he's embraced the TikTok video.
Yes.
And his views on BAPs and CRISPs are incredibly winning compared to the technocratic leaders that we've had in the last few years. And of course, that will be, will serve as a sort of charm initially. But in the end, he's going to have to make sort of serious decisions fast. And I think that the BAP analysis videos could become classics of a sort of oblivious insouciance once things start to go wrong and decisions have to be made. But in foreign policy, Britain still holds many cards. Of course, as always, our destiny will be suspended across the Atlantic to America, but also with Europe, as it always has. But as a legacy power, France and Britain, I call the legacy powers.
Yes.
And I think, but they also have great potential with in alliance with a European military bloc. And of course, the foundation of that military bloc in the future, I hope and believe, will be Ukraine and Poland, which I call war democracies. In which people understand, the youth understand the stakes of freedom and the privileges of living in democracies, in liberal democracies, because of their history, in a way that young people don't today. And therefore, the legacy powers with their nuclear weapons and their small armies will be, I think, in a block with the war democracies in Eastern Europe that will be the future of European democratic power.
And therefore, do you think, in a sense, one of the key tests in foreign policy for any British prime minister is their attitude towards Ukraine and Russia?
Yes, I think they're key tests, but also to the Middle East. And I do think that Burnham, the problem with Burnham, the problem with Starmer, is that the foreign policy of a great nation cannot be formed by small cadres of aggressive activists. And that's rule number one. That is not a national interest.
And therefore, if Starmer or Burnham worry too much about what ardent supporters of a particular critique of Israel or a particular critique of the West, if they worry too much about what the lanyard-wearing university academic classes think, they're not thinking in the broad national interest.
Yeah, I mean, the activist class and Islamist activists, who are extremely different from Muslims, there's a huge difference between Islamists and Islam, as we know.
Oh, well, the book brings it out.
Which is in the book and very clear. But if they allow those small groups of people, due to our first past the post system, which gives immense power to quite obscure constituencies in our Midlands or North, then they will do Britain a huge disservice. And this is just another side of the way that the architecture of the Labour Party could be challenging for the actual interests of the country.
The country as a whole.
The welfare bill is another example of another side of this. So that's one part of it. I think Kemi Badenoch has shown much more clarity, much more force of personality, and I do think that she's shown that she would be an impressive prime minister, and hopefully she'll get the chance to perform that role
by being so clear about what the national interest involves.
By being clear in the national interest, and also by confronting the capture of British institutions, which we're seeing now in
the
universities, the Jason Hardy affair, the police, the extraordinary behaviour of the police investigating journalists for investigating the lies of
a bogus academic.
Of a mountebank.
Yeah, quite.
It's always good to use that word in any Spectator podcast.
It is a core Spectator phrase. The book has been praised from Israeli and Arab peace negotiators, from Western and Middle Eastern statespeople. And I think one of the reasons why, which has been reflected in the observations that you've made, is that there is no absolute black and white. So you talked, of course, about the Western versus Soviet era as being a game of chess. And indeed, there was a Manichaean element to the way in which that conflict was depicted. But in the Middle East overall, what this book shows is a degree of empathy, in the best sense of the word, understanding of all of the actors. And you and I might have our own views about individual political leaders and individual political causes. But I think the great service that this book does is that whatever view you take, wherever your heart lies, the range of understanding that you develop through reading it means that you can appreciate why others take the view that they do. And would you say, in a way, without getting into the tangled and the complex and the heart-rending conflicts of the moment, that whatever conclusions we draw, that it's right to look at things in the round and right to recognize that there are no leaders who can escape a level of criticism. And there is no cause that is so pure that it deserves ardor, that what we should do is approach these questions with that intellectual curiosity and that willingness to understand, which is a precursor to progress.
I think that's right. And I think this book is really an argument for learning about things you don't know, and for facts, and for fact-based history. And of course, the great challenge of history at the moment is to persuade people to look at the facts of actually what happened.
Yeah.
And so in this book, the reason why it's been favored by all sorts of Arab leaders and from all sorts of countries, there are 19 countries in this covered in this book, is because it is very open-minded. And what we need, looking at all the conflicts in the Middle East now, and Sudan, Gaza, whatever it is an open-minded and balanced view that respects facts.
Yes.
And without anything being taboo or banned, without any reigns of terror that banning the discussion of one thing or the other. And that is one of the themes of the book.
Yes. I mean, I have strong views about a variety of issues in the Middle East, but one of the things that I think is striking is that there are one or two historians, we won't necessarily name them, but there are one or two historians who've written about the Middle East who've appeared on platforms, tub-thumping platforms, wearing the scarves and regalia of a particular cause and raising their fists for it. And I don't want to take anything away from their historical scholarship or indeed the integrity of their passion, but I think one of the things, if I may say so, is that there is not a distinction, but there is a very careful way in which you ensure that your private views, which I know are deeply held, but also moderate, are held alongside your commitment to scholarship in the book. And I think it's important that that distinction is drawn, that historians, when they are writing a work of this kind, show fidelity to the facts, and that comes through very clearly. Do you think I'm being unfair on those tub-thumping, platform-stomping historians?
No, I think that one of the themes of my the sort of history that I write is that it isn't polemical.
No.
And one of the challenges with a book like this is to constantly challenge yourself for what you're writing. That's how I do it. And so I'm always testing myself. Am I mentioning as many flaws or atrocities of one side as I am on the other? Am I missing anything out? And I strongly believe that is the duty of a historian, to use facts. If you're reduced to repeating ahistorical, ideological slogans that are not based on history at all, then you may be winning favor in the short term, but ultimately you are undermining history itself. And our duty is partly to entertain, and I hope this book is entertaining.
It certainly is.
But it's also to inform and to introduce people to facts in a way that is fun and exciting, but also informs accurately and in a trustworthy fashion.
Since we're talking about entertainment, just one final thing.
Yeah.
You, I think, are almost unique amongst historians in producing a playlist to listen to accompany the book, not necessarily to listen while you're reading, for you can,
Yeah.
but to help illuminate it.
Yes.
Where did the idea come from? And what's on the playlist?
Well, yes. My book, The World, A History of the World, is the only historical book to have a soundtrack.
Yeah.
And the soundtrack is all the great history songs, which you can define in different ways. It can either be a song that's used a lot by a historical figure. For example, YMCA is the favorite song of Donald Trump. So it's become a political anthem.
Yeah.
Originally, it was a disco pain to disco pleasure, and then a gay anthem, and has now become a Trumpian, almost his version of Napoleon's Partons pour la Syrie, which was the Bonapartist hymn. So that's one example. And another one is a song that's about history. So there are lots of songs about history, from the Night We Drove Old Dixie Down by Joan Baez to Sympathy for the Devil or Boney M, which I know is a very significant song we can discuss in a sec.
Yes.
But so I thought it would be fun to do this. And it's become enormously popular. It's on Spotify. And what it has in order is the greatest history songs. And I think Sympathy for the Devil by the Rolling Stones, because of its brilliant words, incidentally based on Bulgakov's Master and Margarita, as you know, is so brilliant that it's number one, and as it should be. But also, in terms of the Cauldron, it has all the significant songs that are sung by, for example, the Iranian opposition. The songs they were singing as they were in the streets in January this year before they were massacred by the Iranian regime, for example, are in here. So is Nasser's favorite songs by Kulthum, the great Egyptian female chanteuse, who was really the greatest voice of the Arab world. And so they are all in here. And so there are songs from all countries of the world, from Haiti to Russia, to Iran, to Egypt, to Israel, and to Britain. And so there are all these songs. Now, I love history songs, and I think that they need to be celebrated more and taken much more seriously. Don't you think, Michael?
I certainly do.
Yeah.
I think you are right about Boney M's Rasputin.
Yes. I mean, it's a song that I think really can be used as an analysis of late Romanov court culture and history, and as an analysis of Nicholas II and Alexander's late period of their reign.
He was a lover of the Russian Queen, and it was a shame how he carried on.
It was a shame how he carried on, though people would debate whether he was the lover or not. But he was a cat who really was. What was it? He was a cat who really was there, I think it is.
Yes.
Yeah.
I can heartily recommend the playlist that accompanies your History of the World, and I can heartily recommend The Cauldron. I hope Spectator readers have the chance to immerse themselves in The Cauldron in the weeks to come. Simon Sebag Montefiore, thank you very much.